All right. Hello, everyone. As Dinah said, we're talking about the Automation Project Manager, and this is a part of UiPath Academy learning plans. So much of the material that you're going to see comes directly from those plans with a little bit of flavor offered by myself. Today, we're going to talk about the automation operating model. That should be the organization's model that you as an automation project manager will be working within. And as she said, this is session number 3, session 4, moving the automation operating model to a steady state and preparing it to scale is next week in the final class in the final week for the series. So today we're going to talk about the components of an automation operating model. As a project manager, you're part of the components and operating within those components, I should say, managing automation journeys. So the core components of an automation operating model are the steering committee, the business, obviously, an automation COE, and your IT team. And then the supporting components, there are 8 total components, is process improvement, internal audit, change in communications, which are very broad terms in my world, and workforce planning. And you as a project manager have a role in every one of these, or a say, or your role will have a footprint in every one of these. So let's delve into these a little bit further. And we're going to start with with the benefits of an automation operating model. And I get tongue-tied on that quite often, so you have to forgive me. Before we get into those individual components, why do we need to have an automation operating model? Why can't we just go out there, find some opportunities, build them, and keep going? And find some more and build them and keep going, and start building a pipeline and just concentrate on those. And the reason being because we need to scale. If you remember earlier in the sessions, we talked about the quadrant where automations fall. So you have a quadrant for low-hanging fruit, which is easy to build, lower value, either quantitative or qualitative. You have quick wins, which are easy to build but have higher value, qualitative and or quantitative. You have must-dos, sometimes must-do improvements, must-haves. Different people call it different things. These are going to be more complex but have a higher value. And then we have our long-term improvements, which are going to be complex but with a lower value. And if you think about your automations, if you have several quick wins or low-hanging fruit that you're doing, they can be part and parcel of a medium complexity or a must-do improvement or a long-term improvement. So what you're building may be used in those other journeys. So that's why we need to have an operation model so that we can actually have some guardrails, some standards, some structure, so that we're not running around willy-nilly, and so we can provide some guidance and some priorities, and so we can help to scale that model and help to stabilize it and scale it. And that's what we're talking about here. The benefits are it accelerates an organization's ability to achieve our business objective. And this is going to be relative to an organization because different organizations are going to have different business objectives when it comes to automation. Some, like I've mentioned before, will want to use it to reduce costs and possibly headcount. Some want to go into other strategic areas, free up some staff to do some other initiatives. So in either of those structures or any of the many other structures, the operating model helps to accelerate that. Enables the management of benefits and of automated solutions. And when I first started building, we did this whole closing process in an ERP system. Back then, it was PeopleSoft. We had no metrics. We had no guideline of how much it was saving. So an operating model helps us to set those up, key performance indicators, things like that. And we talked about scaling already. We can also scale it to respond to other technologies. I think the big ones that come to mind here are going to be machine learning models, large language models, whether it be Meta AI Llama or Google Flan. So we can scale our operating model and we can bring more intelligence into it as we bring on new technologies. This is going to be big. Accountability and guarantee standards. That's going to be a primary role of your COE, which we'll talk about in a minute, a little more in depth. And it defines roles and identifies gaps. This is very important in workforce planning. Who do we need? What do we need? What skills do we need? Let's talk about operational maturity a little bit. When we first start, I don't know if any of you have ever been on the ground floor of starting an automation journey with an organization. You start with a POC, proof of concept. It's usually a small automation, a quick win, or a low-hanging fruit. We prefer to try a quick win because then the organization can immediately see value, whether it's in cost savings or upskilling of staff or revaluing staff, if that's what you want to call it. So we build a POC to prove out what automation can do, right? And to help build a framework or a mindset in people's heads, in their brains, to see, number one, that it's not as scary as everybody makes it out to be, and number two, this can readily be adopted and expanded. Then we establish it. So we've moved from this proof of concept to establishing the value of RPA. We start working on multiple processes instead of these single wins. Talking maybe the process covers 2 departments or 2 different screens, whatever that might be. And your components of the model evolve in line with that. Your steering committee will evolve. Your IT needs will evolve. Your audit impacts will evolve. And we start focusing on the must-dos. The ones that are more complex have a higher value. We work on the must-dos as we establish it, move out of the quick wins and the low-hanging fruit. These should be, the quick wins and low-hanging fruit should be pretty much done before you can actually move into calling your model established. Expand. We want to go to more business units. We want to cover different areas of the organization. We want to grow it. We are done with our must-do improvements. Our pipeline's filling with more improvements. We kind of, at this point, we're moving away from individual automations and moving towards cross-functional that cover from end-to-end processes that may cover different organizational structures within the company. And so we're moving into those long-term improvements. We're establishing KPIs. We're increasing our staff. Our steering committee is growing. And then we scale. We can now serve a wide range of business needs across the organization because we have a mature COE now. We have mature developers. We have skilled staff. We have a troop of business analysts that are running around the building, half-cocked, trying to gather requirements, analyze documents, and do that gap analysis, do a bunch of 2Bs and as-is workflows. And we have PDDs and SDDs stored in our central repository. We have code repositories. We are scaled, and we are stable. And now we're taking on more and more and more, and the organization in turn is saving more money and becoming much more efficient and effective. End user experience is improved. So that's the goal of the maturity. That's where we want to be. And in many cases, this is where we are. In my personal case, we're probably here at the expand where I work now. All right, let's talk about the core components. I think you've heard me, if any of you have been to my sessions before, you've heard me pound into your little brains the word steering committee. Steering committee can be any type of structure. It could be all CEO level people that are sponsors. It can also be a COE manager. It can have developers. It can have business analysts. You could have a lead developer and a lead business analyst. But in an ideal world, as we start to move and we start to expand to different departments or different teams, we want to bring some people onto the steering committee that are associated with those departments or those teams. And even if you've heard me talk about Nancy, I know everybody's heard me talk about Nancy in my earlier sessions. since we want to be a Nancy operating model, we want to cater to the Nancys and help Nancy become more comfortable with automation. We can even invite the Nancys into our steering committee. Now, remember, as you move off and branch off, let's say you're doing finance and you've pretty much beat a dead horse in finance. There's no more opportunities really in finance, but you have a lot coming over from real estate, or you have a lot coming over from supply chain. So you can move people on or off your steering committee if you need to. But keep in mind that the supply chain folks may have some finance uplines or downlines. So you may want to keep those finance people on. Your steering committee can be a large group, it can be a small group, but it needs to be somebody that's going to make sure that your operating model is aligned with the organizational goals and strategies, that you are being given a vision for growth. And this vision is going to change. It's not static. Your vision for growth is going to change as the organization starts to adopt more and more of your automation practice. Funding, very important. You need licensing. You need skilled people. Visibility. The steering committee is the one. I tell a story about this. One of my CFOs, I may have told it in this session, about how on a call one day, an all hands call, which are normally very casual affairs, and we laugh a lot. She demanded that every person in that organization, every team in that organization, have at least 2 automations in my pipeline, which immediately meant that I needed to build some staff and get some licensing. So your visibility is driven by your steering committee, and they control your scaling by visibility, funding, and vision, and they assign accountability. Who's going to be accountable for what in your automation model? That could be IT. If you have as we all know and have learned, or as UiPath used to say earlier on, UiPath RPA is a business-facing tool, and that used to make some IT folks really mad because there's a sense of ownership there of software running in their systems that's not sponsored by them. That's the responsibility of your steering committee: setting the strategy, financial planning and funding, reporting and management, designing the governance. Governance is very important at a high level. At a more in the weeds level, you're going to find the COE, automation COE, is going to be designing that governance. So let's go over into there and let's talk about what the business does. Now, these could be, if you're with a client, these could be your clients. If you're working in an organization, these could be the people that are impacted by your automation, any one of the departments or individuals that you're working with. The business establishes the culture. They're the ones that are going to be impacted. They're the ones that have to adopt. They're going to test. They're going to find fault. They're going to be relieved. They're going to love the fact of what they did. I just got back to a meeting. I think I told you all if you were here last week. I was sitting in Austin, Texas, because I was visiting the UiPath offices the next day for a large meeting with UiPath and one of our clients. And the individual from the clients got up and stood in front of us and talked to us for an hour about end user experience and how the most gratifying part of her journey in RPA has been the end user experience, the adoption by her users, and the relief that they had not doing the mundane work. Now, I'll tell you, this is a large federal agency, and as you can imagine, federal agencies do a lot of mundane work. So her focus was on user experience, and that's a big part of what the business plays a role in your automation operating model. They tell you what's right, what works, what doesn't work. They hold all of the business context in their little heads. They have all the history, the SMEs. They know how it's supposed to do. They know what the upline, downline impacts. They know what to do in case something goes wrong. That's your business. They're in charge of ideation, conducting intake, and supporting automations. Now, the curriculum in the Academy goes into Automation Hub on this. We're not going to go into Automation Hub, but it might be good for you to understand how Automation Hub works. It's a valuable tool UiPath offers, and I'm not being paid by Diana or Daniel Dinas, the CEO of UiPath, to promote its components. However, Automation Hub is a great way for ideation. And remember, no idea is too stupid. Every idea has value. Not all ideas are going to work, but every one of them is important. So you might want to check into some Automation Hub resources and see what you can learn about that. But that's the responsibility of the business. Keep your pipeline going. DOE, this is your organizing, your managing structure. These are the champions. These are the ones that are going to develop the standards. I haven't ever been in an organization where we didn't have development standards on things like labeling and annotating and nested ifs and the happy path and the happiest path and regex and things like that. The COE is maintaining those standards because they have to maintain quality. All of the automations, the responsibility ultimately falls on the COE and not the developer, because the COE is in charge of code reviews and things like that, testing and things. So they're going to ensure that consistency, because we want to make sure, and as I've preached before, we want to make sure that if someone stepped in your role after you win the lottery, or like Diana and I were talking about earlier, retiring and sitting in our front yard spraying kids who walk in our grass with water, you want that person that's taking your role to step into your automation and know exactly what's going on when they start digging around. Instead of having to open up the assigns, you should have all that annotated on your automation so you can just read what it does, especially when you're doing regex and LinQ, because not all automation developers are familiar with regex and LinQ. The COE's responsibilities: overseeing the program operation, setting the standards like I just talked about, managing quality, conducting intake. And we're going to go into intake quite a bit next Monday. We're going to spend several slides talking about intake, because it's a very important part of your automation model, and supporting automation. So supporting is a little bit different if you're working for a client consulting firm, especially if you're working as in the public sector. Usually you have a year contract with options to renew, but typically at the end of your contract, you're handing off all the work products you've built, all the automations you've built, you're handing them off to a supporting team that is not owned by you, it's owned by the government. So it's very important that in any instance, that's why it's very important that we annotate and label, because someone besides myself is going to be managing my code and my bot automations in the business. All right. Click. Talk about IT. I've been in situations where IT was my best friend, and I've been in situations, and I'm not, hopefully don't offend anybody that's in an IT or works in IT, Diana. I've been in situations where IT felt that somebody in the business shouldn't be writing automation scripts because they're not IT. And there's that sense of ownership that I talked to you about. It's very important that you have IT people on your steering committee, and it's very important that you work closely with IT in a very non-competitive, non-competing relationship, I should say. IT's key responsibilities, I'm sure we all can figure it, can be supporting a secure and scalable automation infrastructure, enable coordination across IT teams, and create policies and processes. When you think about creating policies and processes, this is going to involve things like who promotes, who deploys, what do I need in a SDD? Do we need to customize an SDD? Who's going to manage the Git repositories? Where are the code repositories going to be stored? These are things that IT is going to do, and they're going to govern how the developer builds, and how the solution is addressed during technical design, because IT owns those systems and the business does not. The business owns the process and the ideas, and IT owns the system. So got to work together as besties. Okay, IT-related dependencies. Like I said, Git, security, release notes, upgrades, updates to ERP systems or SaaS solutions. That all falls under IT security and risk management, Intelligence for automation. IT is going to be a big part of adopting large language models, how that evolution, how the large language model evolution looks like. And if you're going to be involved with generative AI, specialized AI, natural language processing chatbots, that's all IT related stuff. Okay. And they're going to collaborate the business, but they're going to handle all that technical stuff, right? A business analyst doesn't necessarily can have a conceptualization of what those things are, and they teach that in the business. UiPath teaches that in the business analyst certification track. What are these? What is AI center? What is document understanding? A solution architect get that. A specialized AI certification like Diane spoke about last week can get those. But your IT people are the boots on the ground that do those things. All right. Let's move on to the supporting component. Process improvement. This is very big. We always approach a business process at the onset and we look for process improvement opportunities. There have been instances in my world where we got into the process improvement part of the process of the automation model, and we ended up not needing to automate that process at all because we improved it on the front end. And we were able to get rid of that process because we improved that process on the front end. And that's a good thing. You don't necessarily need to automate everything in the organization. And you can have a mixture of automation tools, whether it be Power Platform, whether it be Blue Prism, Automation Anywhere, and UiPath. There's a variety of tools for a variety of different types of automation needs. Process improvement is very important because we don't want to automate a bad process because then we have a bad automation. So we re-engineer front-end processes where we can to make sure that they're adaptable and at their pristine level to be automated. And I think as developers, if you've worked as a developer, we know what that looks like. For a business analyst or project managers, that's a little bit more conceptually difficult because we're just looking at a pipeline and prioritizing. And it's not going to be until we get in there that we realize, oh, we don't need to do that after all. Internal audit, GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. If you're in a SOX organization or if you're with the federal government, you're going to be going through quite a bit of audits. A SOX organization is going to make sure that you have your, we've talked about this before, segregation of duties, things like that. Documentation is a big part of that. Security is a big part of that. But I encourage anybody that's involved in project management or program management, for that matter, to have your automation program, not just the project, but the program, undergo a technical audit every year in your organization, if that's available. In a technical audit, they're going to look at your security. They're going to look at your Git. They're going to look at who deploys, who maintains the code. They're going to look at your developer security. Where are your credentials stored? What's your documentation look like? What's your run book look like? A technical audit is a great thing to have from your internal audit. You're going to be audited for SOX compliance already, but a technical audit is very important for the structure of your AOM. Agent communications. I said this is kind of broad. I'm not sure who does this role, maybe a marketing part of your organization, but this is sending out communications in a way that people easily understand them and don't get scared of them. And it's like a happy communication. This is what we're doing. Look what we've done. This is the one that disseminates the information. Now we have evangelists, I guess would fall under there. We have evangelizing in our COE. We have evangelizing in our steering committee. We also want to evangelize to the end users. We want to evangelize to the potential end users. And we want to do that in a happy way that makes them excited about what we're about to do. And workforce planning. Workforce planning, excuse my pings, I've got one of my developers is testing and for automation sends me Teams messages. Workforce planning is where we are upskilling, where we're identifying gaps in our people, where we need to hire, where we can train, cross-train. We do a thing at my organization, I've mentioned it before, I believe, where we cross-train our business analysts and our developers as business analysts. not when we cross-train our advanced developers as business analysts, it gives us more flexibility to pivot and to address organizational needs faster. Or if a business analyst is out on PTO, we can have a developer sit in. We cross-train our business analysts as associate developers so they know the right questions to ask when they're gathering the requirements, when they're evaluating data or documents, or doing that gap analysis of where they are now and where you want to be. If our business analysts know what to ask, know what a developer does, they know what to ask, and that whole process is a little bit more efficient and effective. It's a little bit more seamless when we do cross trains. That's part of workforce planning. What's that workforce going to look like? What's that training going to look like? We, at my organization, all of our developers, based on their skill set, especially when they come in, are onboarded onto what we call a training certification roadmap. And that roadmap gives them the ability to go, if they want the certification, if they want these instructor-led trainings, if they want to go into an AWS certification, or they want a Google certification, whatever it might be, it tells them how to get there. And so everybody's onboarded in a roadmap. We're constantly training because we have to constantly train because the technology changes so often. So again, internal audit, GRC, that protects your operating model from violation while reducing risk, manages consistency and transparency. Another good thing that your internal audit does is it talks about business continuity. What happens if something goes down forever or if something breaks? Most organizations require business continuity plan, legal compliance, and PII are all the key concepts when it comes to internal audit. Change in communications, I think we've covered that off. Workforce planning. Another big thing about workforce planning is incentivizing the idea of learning. What do they get when they upskill besides just the badge in Creditly or whatever, wherever it's stored? Incentivize them, small bonuses, training bonuses, things like that. That's part of workforce planning. All right, talk about the interaction model, and I think we're almost done. We're just going to go into some approaches, and it's 4:30, so maybe I'll finish a little 15 minutes early today, Dinah. Operation automation model, interaction model. Now you may say to yourself, is this really necessary? Do we need to document this? This should actually be part of your program charter when you start and be developed early on. But this is going to evolve quite a bit as you're growing and as you build. Who talks to who? Who handles what? Who's focused on what part of that model? Who are the roles? What are their roles? Let me explain it kind of like in a nutshell so we don't have to read all these words. When we build automations, either from a business analyst role, business analyst, a solution architect, project manager, developer, any one of those roles, there are going to be varying priorities depending on your organization. Why is my automation not built yet? And you've already started on that person's, that kind of deal. Why is my team not getting their automations, but that team is? And you're going to have all these voices. Now, I normally in my daily life live with a lot of voices in my head. So I deal with all these voices in my head already, so I'm used to it. But when you get into a model, you're going to have different prioritized voices asking for things. And when I first started building proof of concepts, when it was a very immature operation model, we always told teams, when we were doing PDDs and we were fleshing out what we were going to build in any of those meetings, who's going to be the person that's responsible for communicating to me? Who's going to be that person responsible? Because I don't want 15 people communicating 15 different stories to a BA, or 15 different questions or stories to a developer or to a project manager, solution architect. Who's going to be the conduit? And that way it forces that business team to coalesce around a message. What's the elevator message? That's what you're going to ask. This is why we need to know this. It's going to help prevent scope creep, and it's going to help prevent a lot of confusion. So it's necessary although it seems kind of ridiculous, it is necessary to have an AOM interaction model, just outlining the roles and who's going to interact with each other within that. And then we also want to talk, we want to make sure that we have meetings now. And some of you, we're going to talk about different approaches to the software development lifecycle in just a moment before we finish for today. But some of you go to Scrum. I go to Scrum every morning at 8 o'clock in the morning with one eye open, one eye shut, and the few hairs I have on my head sticking up. Then we have ceremonies. Then we have sprint ceremonies. Then we have demos, and then we have retrospectives. And my calendar often fills up very quickly. Then we have COs, community of practice meetings, and things like that. So it's very important, especially when you're working with a client. And if you've ever worked with the government sector, they're going to set the cadence for how often you meet. It's usually weekly, and it's not a Scrum. You're just doing reporting to them. And they can call a meeting anytime they want to. When you're working in an organization or in the commercial sector, it's very important to set up a meeting cadence, a communication cadence. We will meet once a week on Thursday, and we'll update you on what we've got. If you want that to be a Scrum meeting, make sure that the organization wants that to be a Scrum meeting. If they want something separate than a Scrum meeting, give them what they want. They're the ones that own the contract. They're the ones that own the product. So it's good to have that cadence established when you're setting expectations on the projects. All right, let's talk about approaches to SDLC. So we have waterfall, predictable. This guy, and it's usually, now these can get a little crazy within themselves. This guy usually, the second guy here usually doesn't end until this guy start, until this guy ends, I should say. This guy doesn't usually start until this guy ends, and so on and so on and so forth. Very predictable structures, very good for, how do I want to say this? Very good for simple structured automations that are not going to involve a lot of change. I don't think there's an organization around, and I may be wrong, that does not use a sole waterfall structure for SDLC. It has its benefits, but it has its risks. What are some of the risks? Change management, for one. How are you going to change? Sometimes when we do change in a waterfall, we are creating backlog items that still impact this automation. So we're only giving them, the client, an MVP, minimally viable product, if we have change orders coming in on this automation mid-build, and we're in a waterfall predictable SDLC model. Some organizations still use it. I've worked in an organization that still uses it. It can be very difficult to work in this, and it's very inflexible. And that the organization wanted that inflexibility. They wanted that structure, that rigid structure, but it does become difficult to work in a predictable or a waterfall project. Agile, this is what most people use, and we're all used to it. If you use it, you're used to the words planning, sprints, demos, like I just said, all of those terms that I just said. Agiles simply say you're going to plan a sprint. They're usually 1 to 4 weeks. I think the average, most common sprint you're going to find is 2 weeks. You're going to develop some features with some user stories attached to it, maybe an epic or a spike. And you're going to say, this is what we're going to do in this sprint. And this is the definition of done. You can do, there's several different formats to do this in. You can do it in DevOps. You can do it in Jira. And there's several different platforms that we can do Agile in. And in the sprint, we're going to do our design, our develop, our test, deploy, and review, and then launch. These could just be components. These could be data gathering, requirements gathering, researching in the sprint. It doesn't have to be plan, design, develop, test, deploy, because you may not do anything in that has anything to do with building. You're breaking your project down, your much larger project down, into smaller components and stories that you can track, and you can be more readily able to adapt to changes with and to incorporate change requests into it, because then you just incorporate it into a new sprint. If it's a normal or if it's a standard or emergency change. Sorry again about the testing that's going on. I can't. All right. For Agile, we may have 5 PIs covering one automation. So you may have 8 different user stories within one feature on an Agile sprint or a project that's in Agile. Finally, before I let you wake up, I think I heard some snoring. That may be Diana back in the background. Let's talk about a hybrid approach. And I think a lot of organizations are just naturally moved into this approach, not even knowing they moved into this approach, right? I think it's just in the process of running an automation project, we just naturally combine the two because that's what we as people do, right? So you have and this is probably becoming the more common or approach, and it's especially common if you're working in the government because these are static requirements collection. Well, let me take that back. If you have a mid to a large t-shirt size automation in the federal government, these can be static requirements collection, planning and strategizing, budget allocation. Some of these can be static. And then you get into design and development, it's going to be agile. Then you move out of here, you move out of the agile part, you're going to go into closure. You're going to go into testing. You're going to go into that kind of deal. And those are more predictable waterfall components than they are agile components in some cases. So it's perfectly okay to use a hybrid approach to software development lifecycle. There's others. There's a separate Scrum approach. There's all kinds of different approaches. I think the 3 that we've talked about here today are the most popular and the most adopted when it comes. And I think when you work with the government, they're going to say, if you ever do work for the government, they're going to say, we want an agile approach, scaled, effective approach, safe, agile, scaled, agile. And they're going to, but then you're going to get in there and a lot of it's still going to be predictive waterfall. So you have to adapt. When you're working with the client, you adapt to what their system is. And if you're setting it up on your own, determine on the type of projects you have, what's the best approach. You don't have to use waterfall for everything. You don't have to use agile for everything. You don't have to use a hybrid for everything. You can use agile, waterfall on some. You can use agile on others. And commonly in some organizations, when we have a large cross-functional, what I call cross-functional automation, the large one will be waterfall, and then different components within their different projects in that program will be agile. All right, that's me done talking. And let you ask questions if you have any questions, or if not, anything in the chat or anything like that.
So somebody wrote in chat, safe, scaled agile framework for enterprise.
Scaled agile framework, yes, right. You would think that's important since I have to take that class in the week, right?
And there were no other questions, but if anybody would like to take themselves off mute and ask anything, that would be great.
I had a question.
Hi, Nina.
How are you? Good, thank you. So if we are working with a client that comes in, it's a small company and says, okay, show us your automation potential for our company, what would be the best tool to use for that?
Show your automation potential. What do you mean show the automation potential?
Like help us figure out the automation potential for all the processes within our company.
The best UiPath tool would be process mining, if they've adopted that. Well, I'm not going to say the best. You have tools available in UiPath. You have process mining, you have task mining, right? And then you have Automation Hub. If your question is very broad, so if I say it, you're talking at a high level. If you go into a new client, they say, show us what of our processes we can automate. Well, what are your processes? Why don't you list all your processes, list processes in Automation Hub, because you can. right? They can put their processes in Automation Hub, and then your team, your COE or your automation team then can then evaluate those and judge what they can do with those automations. And you're going to look for things like, how many screens do I touch?
Right.
How often do these systems get updated? Is it every 6 months? Is it every 3 months? What are my security? Am I going in where I have to choose to log in? Am I going in where I have to count how many bicycles are in the picture, right? You're going to get a good idea once people start brainstorming and ideating and putting that stuff in Automation Hub. You're going to get an idea of what they, number one, consider a process to be, but you're going to get an idea of what they consider complexity of their processes to be, and they may totally differ there from you. So that's when you're able to sit down with them and intelligently say, okay, this is a definition of complexity. Do you want to agree on this definition? Because that helps you guide how you staff something, right?
Right.
Process mining is good, but it has to be run from inside the organization. They have to be able to, your IT department has to be able to integrate your process mining into the systems, because process mining takes the performance of the systems and analyzes that. It makes it very easy to see process efficiencies or bottlenecks, right?
Right.
It's a little bit more complex to use because the IT department of that client needs to, number one, approve for it to be in their environment, but also help you hook that up into those systems that you want to measure. Task mining, you can have assisted or unassisted task mining. Task mining assisted is where you have a group of people sit down and start performing the tasks that you may have identified, or they may be thinking this is an automation opportunity. And it may be one person, two person, three persons, but you want to do that over several iterations of performing that task, because task mining is going to give you how many keystrokes and the time it does to do this and things like that. That's assisted task mining. Unassisted task mining kind of behaves like process mining does, but within a certain group of people. It's where you're measuring, they're monitoring them, not by recording, but in the systems itself. So it's very much like process mining. The only other thing that I can suggest to you is I find it really good, and we found it beneficial where I'm at, that we developed what we call a roadshow, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that roadshow is just a presentation, not just slides, but some live demos and a presentation. And we go to the client, and if they've never heard of RPA, and some people in the government haven't, most have, but if they've never heard of RPA, showing them how a bot works and the outputs and things like that, some testimonials, some interactive things like games. I know that sometimes when you do things with UiPath, they throw in those quizzes and things to get them engaged and involved, if that makes sense. Because your task is to get their minds going, right? And to really buy into what RPA is. We can go in there very official and very generic and say, this is RPA, this is what it does, now give us your business. That's not how people work, and it's not how to promote the technology. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. So it's interesting, Paul is saying that there are clients who don't want to give you access to their computers, and they don't have teams who want to do the Automation Hub work either. So sometimes it's like interesting scenario that you encounter.
You could always do, we used to call these, I've done this before, we used to call them brown bag lunches, where you invite everybody to a brown bag lunch, and everybody brings their own lunch, and they're welcome to join. It's an hour during their lunch break. They can hear about RPA, and they can come up with their own ideas and then submit them to you in a different way, right?
Yeah.
I think what in a situation like what you're talking about, where the people don't want you to get into their systems, but they also don't want to use the tools. I think that's poor messaging coming down from their leadership, right? If their leadership wants UiPath, then their leadership has to pave that way. It's not your job to go in and pave the way, right? You inform and teach, but their leadership has to let everybody know this is what we're doing. I think you're running into some things like You may be running into some IT resistance, but you're running into things like, what happens if I don't do this anymore? I won't have a job, kind of deal.
Right. I'll let you answer Cole's question, but thank you very much. That was very helpful, Chris.
You're welcome, Nina.
Yeah, so Chris, Cole has a question.
Right.
Cole has a question. In my experience, it is difficult to have government agencies trust unassisted task mining, Big Brother watching. Even with all the security and consent
Right.
checks in place, how have you overcome this with your government clients?
It's becoming easier. I'll tell you that much. You've got a lot of adoption in the government of automation suite and core RPA and orchestrator, test suite, and document understanding. I think the Fed ramping of document understanding has really started opening up people's eyes. Now a lot of the RFIs, RFQs, and our things we're getting ROMs are involving process mining. There hasn't been a specific mention of unassisted task mining, but we've done some task mining. They want to talk about large language models and generative and AI and NLP models. So you're getting a lot more. It's getting easier, I think, because there's a lot of chat and there's a lot of chatter about those technologies. You're still getting a lot of memos and documents coming internally throughout the government that worry about bias and Gen AI and things like that. But as we start getting more into grounded models and things like that, and we're able to specialize those models to get rid of some of that bias, you're getting a lot more buy-in from the government. So historically, you are correct, Cole. It has been very difficult. It was a struggle to get machine learning in because machine learning and document understanding uses the Meta AI Llama large language model, right? So it has been very difficult, but it's getting easier. We're not there yet, but it's getting easier. I will say things like data services. I think the only thing that's not on the public sector platform that has not been approved is autopilot. I think there's two or three others that aren't. Communications mining is not approved on the public platform. And I think there's a couple of others. I'd have to look at my most recent release from UiPath on that.
Okay. Well, no, I'm happy I'm not alone in that struggle because, and I did mean process mining, not task mining, but I think they're all kind of in the same boat. You just have that big data effect essentially, and people get concerned. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? I think that's it for this week, Chris.
All
So
right.
Just a reminder, there's one more session next week at the same time, same bat channel. And we thank you all for coming today. Chris, great session.
Am I Batman or are you Robin?
Robin, I'm definitely
You're
Robin.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye.
You